Beloved chosen one, before you pressed play on this message, before this title ever crossed your path, something had already been set in motion far above what your eyes can see. You are here today not because of an algorithm, not because of coincidence, not because you happen to be scrolling at the right moment. You are here because heaven arranged this appointment long before you were born. God's chosen one, I want you to hear this clearly from the very first breath of this message. You have obeyed. You have obeyed in a season when obedience cost you more than anyone around you understood. You have obeyed when the voice of logic screamed at you to stop, when the whispers of fear told you that you were making a mistake, when the silence of heaven felt so long that you began to wonder if you had heard God correctly at all, and yet you obeyed anyway. That kind of obedience is rare. It is the kind of obedience that does not wait for full understanding before it moves. It is the kind of obedience that walks forward even when the ground ahead looks uncertain, even when the outcome cannot yet be seen, even when the people closest to you shake their heads and ask why you would choose such a difficult road. Chosen one, I want you to know that heaven has been watching every single step you have taken, every sacrifice, every quiet tear shed in private, every moment you chose faith over fear when no one else was there to see it. None of it has gone unnoticed. None of it has been wasted. And today, this very message is the confirmation you have been waiting for. Heaven is not distant from your obedience. Heaven is backing it. There is a divine principle woven through the entire story of Scripture, and it is this. When a person obeys God against overwhelming odds, when they choose faith even while everything visible argues against it, heaven does not remain passive. Heaven moves. Heaven responds. Heaven backs that person with resources, protection, favor, and breakthrough that could never have been produced by human effort alone. This is not a formula invented by man. This is a pattern that runs through the entire narrative of the Bible, and today we are going to walk through one of its most powerful examples together. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it might feel like to be given an instruction from God that makes absolutely no sense according to everything you understand about His character and His promises. Imagine being told to do something that appears to directly contradict the very blessing He spoke over your life. Would you still obey? Would you still rise early in the morning, gather what you need, and start walking toward the place of testing, even while your heart trembled with questions you could not yet answer? This is exactly what happened to a man named Abraham, a man who had already waited decades for a promise to be fulfilled, a man who had already walked through seasons of doubt, delay, and disappointment, only to be asked, at the height of his joy, to walk up a mountain and lay everything on the altar. Chosen one, if you have ever felt like your obedience was costing you more than it should, if you have ever wondered whether God truly sees the sacrifice you are making in secret, this message was written for you. If you have ever obeyed a prompt from the Holy Spirit that others around you did not understand, whether it meant leaving something comfortable, forgiving someone who wronged you deeply, giving generously when your own resources were stretched thin, or stepping into a calling that seemed to have no logical path forward, this message was written for you. Heaven has seen every step, and heaven is about to confirm what your obedience has already set in motion. There is a reason this title reached you today. There is a reason your spirit stirred when you read the words you obeyed against all odds. Somewhere inside you, a part of your soul recognized itself in that phrase. You know what it feels like to obey when everyone else would have quit. You know what it feels like to walk forward when the path ahead looked like it was leading toward loss rather than gain. And today, I want to remind you that the story of Abraham on the mountain is not simply an ancient tale meant to inspire admiration from a distance. It is a mirror. It is a prophecy over your own life. Just as heaven backed Abraham's obedience with provision that arrived at the exact moment it was needed, heaven is preparing to back your obedience in the same way. Awaken, chosen one. Awaken to the truth that your life is not being lived by accident. Every delay you have endured, every closed door, every moment of testing has been preparing you for this exact season. The season where obedience meets confirmation, where faith meets provision, where the mountain you climbed in tears becomes the mountain where heaven meets you with abundance. The road has not been easy. I know that. The nights have been long and the questions have outnumbered the answers. But you kept walking, you kept obeying, and that obedience has not gone unnoticed by the one who sees in secret and rewards openly. As we walk through this message together, I want you to hold on to one truth above all others. Obedience is never wasted, even when it feels like it is leading you toward loss. Obedience is the currency of heaven, and heaven always settles its accounts. What you have given up in faith will be returned to you in ways you cannot yet imagine, because the God who asked for your obedience is the same God who provides at the very moment obedience reaches its fullest expression. Stay with me. Let this message settle into the deepest places of your spirit, because by the end of this journey together, you will understand why heaven is not merely watching your obedience from a distance. Heaven is actively backing it and preparing to confirm it and preparing to reward it beyond what you could ask or imagine. And if this message is already stirring something in you, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who is in a season where they cannot make sense of the silence around them. Like this video so that more chosen ones can find their way to this word. Subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you never miss what God is releasing through this channel. The link to go deeper, to sow a seed into this ministry and partner with what heaven is building here, is in the description below and in the pinned comment. Every act of generosity you offer is an act of faith, and God sees every seed planted in obedience. Let us walk together into the story that carries the very heartbeat of this message, the story of a man named Abraham, and the long road that led him to a mountain called Moriah. To understand the weight of what happened on that mountain, we must first understand the road that brought him there. Because obedience against all odds is never a single moment. It is the culmination of years of walking with God through seasons that tested faith long before the final test ever arrived. Abraham's story began with a promise that seemed impossible from the very start. God called him out of his homeland, away from everything familiar, and told him that he would become the father of a great nation, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. There was only one problem. Abraham was already advanced in years, and his wife Sarah had never been able to bear children. The promise contradicted the natural facts of his life completely. And yet Abraham obeyed. He left his country, his relatives, and his father's household, and he set out for a land he did not yet know, trusting a voice that had spoken to him without giving him a map. Years passed. The promise remained unfulfilled. Abraham and Sarah grew older, and the physical possibility of a child grew smaller with each passing season. In their impatience, they attempted to fulfill the promise through their own means, and the result was pain, division, and complications that would echo for generations. But God did not abandon his word. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, long after their bodies had given up any expectation of childbirth, the promise was finally fulfilled. Isaac was born, the son of laughter, the impossible child, the living proof that God's promises do not depend on human timing or human ability. Can you imagine, chosen one, the joy that filled Abraham's household on the day Isaac was born? Can you imagine the relief after decades of waiting, the tears of gratitude, the sense that finally, after so much delay and disappointment, the promise had become tangible, present, and real? Isaac was not simply a son. He was the fulfillment of everything Abraham had believed for, sacrificed for, and waited for across the majority of his adult life. And then, according to Genesis chapter 22 verse 2, came the instruction that would test Abraham beyond anything he had faced before. God said to him, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you." Read those words again, chosen one, and let them settle into your spirit. This was not a small request. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was the very son that the promise had been built upon, the very proof that God's word could be trusted, now being asked to be laid upon an altar with his own father's hand raising the knife. From a purely human perspective, this instruction made no sense at all. It seemed to directly contradict everything God had already promised. How could the covenant be fulfilled through Isaac's descendants if Isaac himself was taken? How could the God who had waited so patiently for this child to be born now ask for him to be given up entirely? This was the kind of instruction that could shatter a person's faith, that could cause someone to question everything they believed about the character of God. And yet, according to Genesis chapter 22 verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and split the wood for the burnt offering, and set out for the place of which God had told him. Notice the posture of Abraham's response. He did not delay. He did not argue. He did not spend days wrestling with God, demanding an explanation before he would move. He rose early in the morning. This is the posture of a man whose obedience had been shaped and refined over decades of walking with God. A man who had learned, through years of testing, that God's character could be trusted even when God's instructions could not be understood. The journey to Moriah took 3 days. 3 days of walking. 3 days with nothing to do but sit with his thoughts. 3 days in which Abraham could have turned back at any moment, could have found a reason to abandon the instruction, could have convinced self that he had misunderstood what God was asking. But he kept walking. According to Genesis chapter 22 verse 4, on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from a distance. When they arrived at the base of the mountain, Abraham told the young men who had traveled with him to stay behind. He said to them, "Stay here with the donkey, and the boy and I will go over there and worship, and we will come back to you." Pay close attention to those words, chosen one, because they reveal something extraordinary about the depth of Abraham's faith. He did not say, "I will go and worship." He said, "We will come back to you." Even in the midst of an instruction that appeared to demand the loss of his son, Abraham held on to a conviction that somehow, in a way he could not yet understand, both he and Isaac would return from that mountain together. Isaac carried the wood for the burnt offering up the mountain, while Abraham carried the fire and the knife. As they walked together, Isaac asked his father a question that must have pierced Abraham's heart in ways words cannot fully capture. He said, "My father, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's response, recorded in Genesis chapter 22 verse 8, is one of the most profound statements of faith found anywhere in Scripture. He said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering." Abraham did not know how this would unfold. He did not have a plan for how God's promise would still be fulfilled through Isaac if Isaac was taken. What he had was a conviction, forged through decades of walking with a faithful God, that somehow, in a way beyond his understanding, provision would arrive. They continued walking together, father and son, up the mountain, toward the place of the altar, toward the moment when obedience would be tested to its absolute limit. You felt something in those 7 minutes of silence. I know you did, because chosen ones always feel it when the frequency shifts even slightly. What you felt was not imagination. It was your brain responding to stillness, the way a parched field responds to the first rain after a long drought. And what Dr. James Rivers spent 30 years building is the precise science of why that happens and how to make it happen fully, consistently, and in 7 minutes every single day. Let me give you the full picture now, the way I promised I would. There is a frequency that chosen ones are born carrying. Researchers in neuroscience call it gamma. It sits at the upper range of the brain's electrical activity, and what happens in the mind when gamma is fully activated reads like a description of everything chosen ones are called to be. Heightened perception, rapid pattern recognition, deep compassion, clarity that arrives not through effort but through a kind of inner knowing that bypasses the logical, plodding steps the average mind depends on. The moments in your life when you just knew something, when you felt a direction without being able to explain where the certainty came from, when a solution appeared in your mind fully formed without you working toward it. Those were gamma moments. That was your birthright frequency, doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here is what happens over time, and this is the part that no one talks about honestly enough. Long seasons of hardship, years of carrying unanswered prayers and deferred hopes, seasons of isolation and misunderstanding, and the specific kind of grief that comes from waiting for something you cannot even fully describe. All of that presses down on the brain in measurable, documented ways. The gamma frequency does not disappear entirely. It gets suppressed. It gets buried under the accumulated weight of cortisol and stress responses, and the constant low-grade vigilance that comes from living inside a season that has lasted longer than you thought you could bear. The fire does not go out, but the flame gets smaller, and a chosen one walking around with a suppressed gamma frequency is like a lighthouse with a dimmed bulb. The structure is still there, the purpose is still there. The foundation is still solid, but the light that was meant to reach the ships in the dark is not reaching them the way it should. Dr. James Rivers understood this problem at a level that most researchers never reached, because he was not just studying the brain in the abstract. He spent over 30 years, research affiliated with MIT, mapping the specific conditions under which the gamma frequency is suppressed and the precise conditions under which it can be restored. What he discovered was not complicated in its delivery, even though the science underneath it is extraordinarily precise. The brain has a remarkable property called entrainment. It means that when the brain is exposed to an external frequency through carefully engineered sound, it will naturally synchronize with that frequency, the way one tuning fork in a room will begin to vibrate in response to another tuning fork being struck nearby. Your brain does not have to try to match the frequency. It does not require concentration or skill or years of meditation practice. The synchronization happens because that is how the brain is built. What the Genius Wave delivers in its 7-minute audio is a layered combination of binaural beats and isochronic tones, sound frequencies calculated with extraordinary precision that guide the brain through a specific sequence. It first opens the theta range, the frequency of deep creativity, accelerated learning, and the intuitive knowing that children access naturally before the world trains it out of them. And then, from that theta foundation, it activates gamma. The sequence matters. Theta creates the conditions in which gamma can fully emerge. The way a field has to be prepared before the seed can take root. 7 minutes is not an arbitrary number. It is the precise window of time Dr. Rivers identified through his research as optimal for this entrainment cycle, long enough to complete the synchronization, short enough that the brain does not fatigue and resist. You already felt a version of this in the 7 minutes of silence you gave yourself a few moments ago. What you felt was your brain beginning to shift toward its own natural stillness. The genius wave does not create something foreign in you. It clears the path back to something that was always yours. I want to tell you about a woman named Patricia. She had been a chosen one her whole life in the sense that she always felt a pull towards something larger than her circumstances. Always carried a sense of purpose that her surroundings had not yet confirmed. But after 11 years of building a business that collapsed, a marriage that ended quietly, and a season of starting over in her mid-40s that no one around her seemed to understand, her mind felt like a room where someone had turned the lights down very low. She was functional, she was even kind, but the clarity she had once trusted, the inner knowing that had guided her best decisions, felt distant and unreliable. She found the genius wave through a message like this one, and she committed to 7 minutes every morning for 3 weeks. She told the story herself later. In the 3rd week, she woke up one morning and sat down with her journal and wrote 4 pages without stopping, a complete and clear direction for the next chapter of her life, the kind of clarity she had not felt in over a decade. She said it felt less like inspiration and more like remembering something she had always known, but had been too exhausted to access. Patricia is not an outlier. She is an example of what happens when a chosen one stops fighting against the suppression and simply gives the brain what it needs to return to itself. Now, I know that some of you are sitting with a thought right now that sounds something like this. $39 is not nothing. And I want to acknowledge that honestly, because I respect you enough not to pretend that every person hearing this message is in a season of financial ease. $39 is real. It represents something. And only you know what it represents in your specific situation right now. What I can tell you is this. The Genius Wave was priced at $49. Through the link in the pinned comment below, it is available today for $39, and it comes with a 90-day money-back guarantee, which means you are not being asked to take a risk. You are being asked to make a decision with a full safety net underneath it. If you use it for 90 days and you do not feel a shift, you ask for your money back, and it is returned to you completely. No argument, no process designed to wear you down. The guarantee is real because Dr. Rivers is not selling a hope, he is offering a result. There is one thing I need to say directly and clearly. Because the Genius Wave has been shared in communities like this one, there are imitations circulating online, audio files with similar names that were not developed by Dr. Rivers and do not carry the precision of the original engineering. If you purchase one of those, you will not get what you are looking for, and you will have spent money on something that was never designed to do what the real product does. There is only one source. It is the single link in the pinned comment below this video. That is the only place this message endorses. Please do not search for it elsewhere and trust what comes up in the results. Go directly to the pinned comment. I also want to be transparent with you about something practical. The price of $39 through this link is not a permanent offering. The number of units available at this preferential rate is limited, And when that threshold is reached, the price returns to $49. I am not saying this to create pressure. I am saying it because I would rather you have the full information and make a decision from a place of clarity than arrive at the link tomorrow and find that the window has closed. If today is a yes for you, the pinned comment is where you go. If you need more time to sit with it, I understand that completely, and everything else in this message belongs to you regardless of what you decide. What Dr. Rivers built is not a shortcut. It is a restoration. It is a way of giving back to a chosen one what a long season took without permission. The work you have done in the hidden years, the character that was built in the waiting, the depth of root that grew in the quiet places, none of that changes. What the genius wave does is restore the frequency through which all of that work can finally be expressed at its full power. You already have everything that was placed in you at the beginning. 7 minutes a day is simply the way you stop carrying it at half strength. Now that we have walked through the road that led Abraham to the mountain, let us pause and consider the spiritual meaning woven into every step of that journey. Because this story is not simply about an ancient patriarch and his son. It is a living picture of what obedience against all odds looks like, and it is a mirror held up to your own life, chosen one. The altar on Mount Moriah represents the place where everything you hold precious is laid before God in complete surrender. It is not a place of loss for the sake of loss. It is a place of transformation, where what you offer in faith becomes the very avenue through which heaven pours out its greatest confirmation. When Abraham arrived at that place, according to Genesis chapter 22, verse 9, he built the altar there, arranged the wood, bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Every motion was deliberate. Every action was an act of surrender carried out in obedience, even while his heart must have been breaking with each step. Here is the spiritual truth I want you to receive today. God was never actually interested in Isaac's death. What God was testing was the posture of Abraham's heart. Was Isaac an idol that had replaced God's place in Abraham's affection? Or was Abraham's love for God greater than his love for the very promise God had given him? This is a question that echoes into your own life today. What has God asked you to lay on the altar? What has He asked you to surrender? Not because He wants to take it from you permanently, but because He wants to see whether your trust in Him is greater than your attachment to the blessing itself. Chosen one, perhaps you have been asked to surrender a relationship that felt like your entire future, only to discover that God had something greater waiting on the other side of that obedience. Perhaps you have been asked to surrender financial security, stepping into a call that seemed to threaten your stability, only to trust that the God who asked for the sacrifice would also provide the resources needed to sustain you. Perhaps you have been asked to surrender your own timeline, your own plans, your own understanding of how your story was supposed to unfold, and to trust instead in a plan authored by a God whose ways are higher than your ways. The altar is never the end of the story. The altar is the place where faith is proven and where provision meets obedience at the exact moment it is needed. According to Genesis chapter 22, verse 10, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. This is the moment of ultimate surrender, the moment when obedience reached its highest and most costly point. There was no more room for hesitation. There was no more room for a plan of his own devising. Abraham had reached the point where his obedience was complete, where nothing was held back, where the sacrifice had become total. And it was at that exact moment, according to Genesis chapter 22, verse 11, that the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here," the angel said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Do you see it, chosen one? Heaven intervened at the precise moment when obedience reached its complete and total expression, not a moment before. Not because Abraham had done enough to earn the intervention through effort or striving, but because his heart had proven, through obedience against overwhelming odds, that his trust in God was greater than his need to control the outcome. This is the spiritual principle at the very center of this message. Heaven does not typically intervene before obedience is fully expressed. Heaven intervenes at the point of complete surrender, when the striving of the flesh has ended and the trust of the Spirit has taken its place. Perhaps this is exactly where you find yourself today. Perhaps you have walked the road, carried the wood, built the altar, and stretched out your hand in full surrender, wondering when heaven would respond. I want you to hear this clearly. The delay you have experienced is not a sign of abandonment. It is often the final stretch before the voice of heaven breaks through with the exact word you have been waiting to hear. Do not lay down your obedience now. Do not withdraw your hand from the altar in frustration just before the moment of breakthrough arrives. And then, according to Genesis chapter 22, verse 13, Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Notice something remarkable here. The ram was not sent down from heaven in that instant. The language suggests the ram was already there, caught in the thicket, waiting to be discovered at the precise moment it was needed. This is such a powerful picture of how heaven backs obedience. Often, the provision you need has already been positioned by God long before you ever reach the place of your greatest test. It is not that God scrambles to produce a solution the moment your obedience is proven. It is that God has already prepared the provision in advance, waiting for the moment your surrender opens your eyes to see what has been there all along. Chosen one, the resources, the doors, the relationships, the breakthroughs you need may already be positioned around you, waiting for the moment your obedience reaches the place where your eyes are finally opened to receive them. Abraham named that place the Lord will provide, and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." This is not simply a historical marker. It is a prophetic declaration over every person who dares to obey God against all odds. On the mountain of your obedience, in the very place where surrender felt costly beyond measure, it shall be provided, not somewhere else, not at some later, unrelated time. On that very mountain, in that very place of surrender, provision arrives. And the story does not end with the ram. According to Genesis chapter 22, verses 15 through 18, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and delivered one of the most extraordinary covenant promises found anywhere in Scripture. Because Abraham had done this thing and had not withheld his son, his only son, God swore by himself that he would surely bless Abraham, multiply his descendants as the stars of the heaven and the sand on the seashore, and that his descendants would possess the gate of their enemies, and that in his offspring all the nations of the earth would be blessed, because Abraham obeyed God's voice. This is what it means for heaven to back your obedience, chosen one. It is not a small acknowledgement. It is not a quiet nod of approval from a distance. It is God swearing by himself, staking his own name and character on the confirmation of your obedience, multiplying the blessing far beyond what was originally promised. Abraham's obedience did not simply preserve what he already had. It expanded the blessing into something greater than he had ever imagined. This is the pattern heaven wants. to repeat in your life today. What you have just recognized in yourself today is not only personal. You are not alone in this recognition. Across the world, at this very moment, other chosen ones are arriving at these same 4 signs, in different languages, in different seasons, in different circumstances, and experiencing the same quiet shock of finally being seen. You are part of a wave of people waking up at the same time to the same truth about who they are and what their waiting has meant. If this message found you today, it is because you were ready to be found. And if you feel moved to let the message travel further, I want to gently invite you to press like so it reaches the next person who is ready to be named, to leave a word in the comments as a weighing, you were here and you showed up for yourself today, and to share this with someone who has been searching for the stillness this moment carries. If you feel led to leave a blessing in the pinned comment below and pass something forward to the next chosen one who finds their way here, that quiet act of generosity belongs to this moment too. And if you would like to remain part of this community, choosing to subscribe is simply choosing to stay at the table. If what I have just described is true for you, if you see yourself in these signs, if the weight of the waiting has been real and the sadness has been real and the door in the dream has been real, I want to invite you to leave one word in the comments below. The word is this: I see it. Type those 3 words and let them be your marker that you were here, that you heard this, and that something in you recognized itself today. Now let us turn our attention to the practical signs that reveal when heaven is backing an act of obedience, because I do not want you to simply admire this story from a distance. I want you to recognize these patterns actively working in your own life right now, chosen one, in the specific circumstances you are walking through today. The first sign to recognize is this: when your obedience feels costly and misunderstood by the people around you, this is often a sign that heaven is preparing to back what you have done in secret. Think about Abraham's journey. He did not explain the full instruction to the young men who traveled with him. He simply told them to wait at the base of the mountain. There are seasons of obedience that cannot be fully explained to the people around you, not because you are hiding something shameful, but because what God is doing in you is too sacred, too personal, and too far ahead of what others can currently understand. If you have taken a step of obedience recently, whether it was leaving a job that no longer aligned with your calling, ending a relationship that was leading you away from God's purpose for your life, or stepping into a ministry or a dream that others around you dismissed as unwise, I want you to know that the isolation you may have felt in that decision is not a sign that you made a mistake. It is often a sign that you are walking a path that requires a level of trust only you and God can fully understand right now. Heaven sees what others cannot see. Heaven understands the weight of what you carried up that mountain, even when no one else around you fully grasped it. The second sign to recognize is the presence of a long stretch of silence between the act of obedience and the moment of visible provision. Abraham walked for 3 days before he even reached the mountain, and once he arrived, he still had to build the altar, arrange the wood, bind Isaac, and stretch out his hand before the voice of heaven finally spoke. If you are in a season where you obeyed God some time ago, whether it was months or even years, and you still have not seen the full confirmation of that obedience, please do not interpret the silence as abandonment. The 3 days of walking were not wasted time. They were part of the process that shaped Abraham's faith into something unshakable by the time he reached the mountain. Consider the listener who stepped out in faith financially, perhaps giving sacrificially when their own resources were already stretched thin, trusting that God would honor that generosity with provision. If you are in the stretch of time between the sacrifice and the provision, know that this waiting period is not evidence that your obedience went unnoticed. It is often the very stretch of road that prepares your heart to recognize provision when it finally appears, just as Abraham's eyes were finally opened to see the ram that had likely been there for some time already. The third sign to recognize is a moment when your own strength and understanding run out completely, and you find yourself with nothing left to offer but simple trust. This is the moment when Abraham stretched out his hand to take the knife, having exhausted every explanation, every alternative, every plan of his own devising. This is often the exact moment when heaven chooses to intervene, not before, but precisely when human effort has reached its absolute limit. If you feel like you have nothing left, like you have done everything you know how to do, and the outcome still has not appeared, this may not be a sign of failure. It may be the very threshold of breakthrough. Consider the listener who obeyed God in forgiving someone who deeply wronged them, releasing bitterness even when every part of their flesh wanted to hold onto the pain. This kind of obedience often does not produce an immediate emotional reward. It can feel, in the moment, like giving something away without receiving anything in return. But this obedience is precisely the kind of surrender that positions a person to receive healing, freedom, and peace that could never have been accessed while bitterness remained. The ram was already there. It simply needed the surrender to open the eyes to see it. The fourth sign to recognize is this: when heaven finally speaks or intervenes, it often confirms far more than what was originally at stake. Abraham did not simply keep his son. He received an expanded covenant blessing that multiplied far beyond the original promise. This is the pattern of heaven's backing. It rarely simply restores what was risked. It multiplies. If you have obeyed God in a costly way, expect the confirmation, when it arrives, to exceed what you originally hoped for. Do not set your expectation only on getting back what you gave up. Set your expectation on receiving what heaven multiplies in response to genuine obedience. Let me speak directly now to the specific circumstances many of you are walking through as you listen to this message. If you are someone who stepped away from a stable career, a familiar city, or a comfortable routine because you sensed God calling you into something new, and you are now in the uncomfortable middle of that transition, wondering whether you heard Him correctly, hold on to this truth. Your obedience has already been recorded in heaven. The provision for the road ahead is already being prepared, even if you cannot yet see it. If you are someone who obeyed God in a decision that isolated you from people you once depended on, whether family, friends, or a community that did not understand your calling, know that heaven has not left you in that isolation. The very obedience that cost you those relationships is the same obedience heaven is preparing to back with new relationships, new provision, and new confirmation that will more than fill what was lost. And if you are someone who gave sacrificially, trusting God with resources, time, or comfort that you could not easily spare, know that the ram is already positioned. The provision you need has already been placed by God, waiting for the exact moment your obedience opens your eyes to receive it. Chosen one, these signs are not abstract theological concepts meant only for ancient patriarchs. They are patterns woven into the very character of God, patterns that repeat generation after generation for every person who dares to obey against all odds. Watch for these signs in your own life. Recognize the isolation, the silence, the exhaustion of your own strength, and know that each of these is not a signal of abandonment, but often the final stretch of road before heaven's confirmation breaks through. Let me share with you a story that illustrates these very truths. A story of a woman I will call Miriam, whose journey mirrors the pattern we have been walking through together. Miriam had spent nearly 15 years working in a corporate career that provided stability, comfort, and a predictable path forward. On paper, everything about her life looked secure. But somewhere in the quiet hours of prayer, she began sensing a persistent call from God to step away from that career and dedicate herself fully to a ministry that served women recovering from addiction, a ministry that at the time had almost no funding and no guaranteed income. Miriam wrestled with this call for nearly a year before she finally obeyed. The decision made no logical sense to the people around her. Her closest friends questioned whether she had lost perspective. Her own family expressed concern that she was giving up financial security for something unstable and unproven. But the call would not leave her. Each time she tried to push it aside and continue in her familiar career, the conviction grew stronger until finally, much like Abraham rising early, in the morning she made the decision to obey. The first year after her transition was, by any practical measure, extremely difficult. Her savings dwindled quickly. The ministry she had stepped into struggled to secure consistent funding, and there were months when Miriam genuinely did not know how she would cover her own basic expenses. She often described this period as her own version of the 3-day journey, a long stretch of walking forward in faith, without any clear indication of how the story would resolve. She continued serving the women in the recovery program, pouring herself into their healing, even while her own financial future remained uncertain. There was a particular week, close to the 1-year mark of her transition, when Miriam reached what she later described as her own altar moment. Her bank account had reached its lowest point. A ministry partner who had promised ongoing support had unexpectedly withdrawn, and Miriam sat alone one evening, feeling as though she had given everything she had, with nothing left to offer except her continued trust in the God who had called her into this work in the first place. She prayed a simple prayer that night, telling God that even if provision never came, she would not walk away from the calling because she trusted that His character was greater than her current circumstances. Within days of that prayer, something remarkable happened. A woman who had gone through the recovery program years earlier, someone Miriam had poured into during an especially difficult season of her own journey, reached out unexpectedly. This woman had since built a successful small business and had been quietly saving resources specifically to give back to the ministry that had helped her rebuild her life. She contacted Miriam, not knowing anything about the financial crisis Miriam was walking through, and offered a gift that covered not only the immediate need but sustained the ministry for several months moving forward. Miriam later described this moment as her ram in the thicket. The provision had not appeared out of nowhere in that instant. It had been quietly growing for years, prepared long before Miriam ever reached her lowest point, positioned by God in advance, waiting for the moment her surrender opened the door for it to arrive. She had not known, during the darkest weeks of financial uncertainty, that the very woman she had once served was already preparing to become the answer to her own need. But the story did not end there. In the months that followed, the ministry began to gain recognition it had never received before. Other women who had gone through the program began reaching out with similar stories, some offering financial support, others offering their time and skills. And within 2 years, what had once been a fragile, underfunded ministry became a stable, respected organization serving dozens of women each year. Miriam often reflects that if she had turned back during that difficult first year, If she had allowed the isolation and the financial strain to convince her that she had misheard God, she would have missed the very breakthrough that was already being prepared on her behalf. I share Miriam's story because it mirrors so many of the circumstances so many of you are walking through today. Perhaps you, like Miriam, have obeyed a call that made no sense to the people around you, a call that required you to release something stable in exchange for something uncertain. Perhaps you are currently in the stretch of the journey where the provision has not yet appeared, where the silence feels heavy, where you wonder whether the sacrifice was worth it. I want you to hold on to Miriam's testimony as evidence that the pattern we have been discussing is not simply theoretical. It is alive and active in the lives of ordinary people today, people who chose obedience against all odds and discovered, often only after the fact, that heaven had already been preparing the provision long before they ever reached their lowest point. Perhaps your own version of this testimony is still being written. Perhaps you are in the middle of your own 3-day journey, carrying the wood up the mountain without yet knowing where the lamb will come from. I want to remind you, just as Abraham told Isaac, that God will provide for himself the offering. You do not need to have the full picture right now. You do not need to understand exactly how the provision will arrive or when it will appear. What you need is the same posture Abraham carried up that mountain in, a willingness to keep walking, to keep obeying, and to trust that the God who asked for the sacrifice is the very same God who has already positioned the provision in advance. As we move forward into the remainder of this message together, I want you to carry Miriam's story with you, along with Abraham's story, as twin reminders that obedience is never wasted. Even when the road feels long and the silence feels heavy, heaven has never abandoned those who obey against all odds, and heaven is not about to start with you. Chosen one, I want you to pause with me now, right here, in this moment, because we have arrived at the very heart of this message. Everything we have walked through together, the road to Moriah, the wood carried without a visible lamb, the altar built with trembling hands, the knife raised in complete surrender, all of it has been leading us to this single truth that I need you to receive deep into your spirit today. God has never abandoned you, not for a single moment, not during the longest night of your waiting, not during the loneliest stretch of your obedience, not even in the silence that felt, at times, like it might never break. Think again of Abraham standing at that altar. Imagine the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears as he stretched out his hand. Imagine the years of walking with God that had brought him to that exact place. Every previous test, every previous delay, every previous moment of faith, all converging into this single act of surrender. And in that moment, when the weight of obedience had reached its absolute peak, heaven did not remain silent. The voice called out from above, not a moment too late, but at the precise second it was needed. Abraham, Abraham, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy. Chosen one, hear this and let it settle into the deepest parts of your heart. The God who spoke to Abraham at the exact moment of his greatest surrender is the same God who is watching over you right now. He has not forgotten the nights you spent in prayer, wondering if your obedience made any difference at all. He has not overlooked the sacrifices you made quietly, without recognition, without applause, without anyone standing beside you to acknowledge the weight of what you carried. Every tear you shed in secret has been recorded. Every act of faith you walked out while others doubted you has been witnessed by the one whose opinion matters more than any other voice in your life. There is a reason this moment in Abraham's story is described with such intensity, because it reveals something profound about the nature of God. He is not a distant observer, watching from far away as his children struggle to obey. He is intimately present, tracking every step, every hesitation, every moment of courage that rises up in the midst of fear. When Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the ram caught in the thicket, it was not a random coincidence. It was the unveiling of a provision that had already been placed there by a God who knew, long before Abraham ever set foot on that mountain, exactly what this moment would require. Chosen one, I want you to consider your own mountain for a moment. I want you to think about the specific place where your own obedience has cost you the most. Perhaps it is a relationship you released because you sensed it was not aligned with what God had for your life, and now you sit in the quiet aftermath, wondering if you made the right decision. Perhaps it is a calling you stepped into that, stripped away the security you once relied on, and now you find yourself in the uncomfortable middle, waiting for confirmation that has not yet arrived. Perhaps it is a season of forgiveness you walked through, releasing bitterness towards someone who deeply wronged you, even though your flesh wanted to hold onto that pain as a form of protection. Wherever your mountain is, whatever your altar looks like, I want you to hear the voice of heaven speaking over you in this very moment. You are not forgotten. You are not overlooked. The obedience you have carried, even when it felt unnoticed by everyone around you, has been seen in full by the one who matters most. And just as the ram was already positioned in the thicket, long before Abraham's eyes were opened to see it, the provision you need has already been set in motion. It is not something heaven is scrambling to produce in response to your crisis. It is something that has already been prepared, waiting for the moment your surrender allows you to see it clearly. There is something else I want you to notice about this moment in the story. The angel did not simply stop Abraham from harming Isaac. The angel declared, "Now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." This was not God discovering something he did not already know. This was a declaration made for Abraham's benefit and for the benefit of every generation that would read this story afterward, confirming that Abraham's obedience had been proven, tested, and validated in the sight of heaven. Chosen one, heaven is making that same declaration over you today. Every step of obedience you have taken, every sacrifice you have made in faith, every moment you chose trust over fear, has been recorded as proof of the fear of the Lord within you. Proof of a heart that values God's voice above personal comfort, above human understanding, above the approval of others. This is not a small thing. This is the very foundation upon which heaven builds its greatest blessings. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the relief that must have flooded through Abraham's body the moment he heard that voice call out from heaven. Imagine the tears that likely fell, not just from relief, but from the overwhelming realization that God had seen everything, understood everything, and had never intended for the sacrifice to end in loss. Imagine Isaac, still bound on the altar, watching his father's hands untie the ropes, watching his father turn and look toward the thicket where the ram had appeared. This moment was not simply the end of a test. It was the beginning of a new depth of relationship between Abraham and God, a depth that could only have been reached through the complete surrender that had just taken place. Chosen one, this is the invitation before you today. The emotional weight you have carried, the exhaustion of obeying without seeing the outcome, the fear that perhaps your sacrifice would end in loss rather than provision, all of it is being met right now with the same declaration that echoed across that mountain thousands of years ago. Do not lay down in despair. Do not withdraw your hand in defeat. Lift your eyes, just as Abraham lifted his, and look around you, because the provision you need may already be closer than you realize, positioned by a God who has never once abandoned those who trust him. And remember this, the story did not end with the ram alone. It ended with an expanded covenant, a blessing multiplied beyond anything Abraham had originally been promised. This is the pattern heaven is preparing to repeat in your life. Not simply a restoration of what you sacrificed, but a multiplication of blessing that will testify for years to come of what happens when a person obeys God against all odds. Heaven is not simply watching your obedience from a distance today, chosen one. Heaven is actively backing it, preparing to confirm it in ways that will leave no doubt in your heart that every step of faith you have taken was worth the cost. Now, in this season where your assignment is expanding and the calling on your life is pressing into its next dimension, the condition of your mind matters more than it ever has before. You cannot carry a large assignment with a mind that is operating under the weight of chronic stress, mental fog, and the accumulated noise of everything that has tried to crowd out your clarity. This is not a spiritual weakness. It is a physiological reality. And it is the reason that what was introduced earlier in this message deserves to be revisited gently. Because a chosen one stepping into the fullness of their calling needs every resource available to them, in the spirit and in the natural. The Genius Wave audio, developed through more than 30 years of neuroscience research by Dr. James Rivers, is not a luxury for people with manageable lives. It is a tool for people carrying large assignments who cannot afford to operate at reduced mental capacity. 7 minutes a day of theta and gamma brainwave activation is not a small thing when you understand what those frequencies unlock. Clarity returns. Creative problem solving expands. The mental fog that stress and prolonged pressure produce begins to lift. And in that lifted state, the voice of God that you have always been able to hear becomes easier to follow, because the static that was competing with it has been quieted. If you have not yet followed the link in the pinned comment to access the Genius Wave at $39 with the full 90-day guarantee, this is a gentle reminder that it is there, that the window at this price is limited, and that a chosen one stepping into their largest assignment yet deserves a mind that is fully equipped to carry it. And speaking of carrying things together, there is something this community wants to say to you, not as an obligation, but as a genuine sharing of where things stand. This channel exists for one reason, and that reason is you. It exists to find the chosen ones who are in the middle of seasons too heavy to carry alone, and to speak words over them that remind them of who they are and what is coming. That is the only agenda here. There is no product being sold from this channel, no advertisement, revenue being generated, no corporate partnership funding these messages. If this message has met you somewhere real today, if something spoken in this section or in the sections before it has shifted something in your spirit that needed to be shifted, and if you feel moved to help channel continue doing what it was built to do, there is a donation link waiting for you in the pinned comment and in the video description. Whatever you are able to give is received with genuine gratitude and treated as the seed it is. Even the smallest amount of support allows this ministry to keep showing up for the next chosen one who finds their way here at 3 in the morning, surrounded, exhausted, and needing to hear that they are not forgotten. And if giving financially is not something you are able to do right now, there is still something deeply meaningful you can do. Share this video, like it, leave a comment that tells heaven and this community that the word found you. Subscribe so that the next message finds you the moment it arrives. These acts of engagement are not small. They are the way a message travels from the person it reached to the person it was also meant for. You were found by this word today. Now, let this word use you to find someone else. Now let us turn to the scriptures that reinforce this truth. Because the promises we have discussed are not built upon feeling alone. They are built upon the unshakable foundation of God's own word. I want to walk through several passages with you, chosen one, so that your faith is anchored not simply in a story, but in the very character of God as revealed throughout Scripture. The first passage comes from the book we have already been exploring together, Genesis chapter 22, verse 18, where the angel of the Lord declares to Abraham, "In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Notice the direct connection between obedience and blessing in this verse. The blessing was not simply given because Abraham was chosen. It was given specifically because he obeyed. This reveals a spiritual principle that applies to your own life today. Obedience opens the door to blessings that would otherwise remain unrealized, even for those who are already called and chosen. The second passage comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 2, which says, "And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God." This verse carries a beautiful image within it. The blessings are described as something that overtakes the obedient person, suggesting a pursuit, an active movement of favor chasing down the one who walks in obedience. Chosen one, if you have obeyed God even when it cost you deeply, know that blessings are described in Scripture as actively pursuing you, even now, even in this season of waiting. The third passage comes from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, where the prophet Samuel declares, "To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams." This verse is particularly significant, given the imagery we have been walking through together, since it draws a direct contrast between the outward appearance of sacrifice and the inward reality of obedience. God is not simply interested in the actions we take. He is interested in the posture of trust and surrender behind those actions. Your obedience, even when it looked small or went unnoticed by others, has been received by God as something far greater than an empty ritual. It has been received as an act of genuine trust. The fourth passage comes from the book of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, which reflects directly on Abraham's story, saying, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son." The passage continues in verse 19, explaining that Abraham considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. This passage reveals something profound about the depth of Abraham's faith. He was not simply hoping that God would intervene before the sacrifice was completed. He was prepared to trust God even beyond the point of apparent loss, believing that God's power was greater than the finality of death itself. Chosen one, this is the depth of trust heaven is inviting you into today, a trust that extends beyond simply hoping for a good outcome, into a deep confidence that God's power and character remain trustworthy, even in the moments when the outcome seems impossible. The fifth passage comes from the book of Psalm chapter 34, verse 19, which says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." This verse reminds us that obedience does not exempt a person from difficulty. Abraham still had to walk the 3-day journey. He still had to endure the emotional weight of the test. He still had to raise his hand toward the altar before deliverance arrived. If you have experienced affliction in the midst of your obedience, this verse assures you that affliction is not evidence of God's absence. It is often simply part of the process that precedes deliverance. The sixth passage comes from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 12, which says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." Chosen one. Notice the emphasis on remaining steadfast. Abraham did not waver partway up the mountain. He did not turn back when the weight of the instruction became unbearable. He remained steadfast until the very end of the test, and it was at that point of completed steadfastness that the crown of provision and blessing was received. The seventh and final passage I want to leave with you comes from the book of Galatians, chapter 6, verse 9, which says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." This verse speaks directly to the exhaustion that so often accompanies long seasons of obedience. Perhaps you feel weary today. Perhaps the road has felt longer than you expected, and the provision has not yet appeared in the way you hoped. This verse does not promise that weariness will never come. It promises that the harvest will come in due season, provided that you do not give up before that season arrives. Chosen one. Let these scriptures settle into your spirit as an anchor for everything we have discussed together. Your obedience is not unnoticed. Your affliction is not evidence of abandonment. Your weariness is not a sign that the harvest will never come. These are simply the natural markers of the road that leads toward the mountain where provision meets obedience. The very mountain where heaven has already prepared what you need, waiting for the moment your eyes are open to receive it. Let us come together now in prayer, chosen one, because I believe there is something powerful that happens when the truths we have walked through are lifted up before God in agreement together. I want you to find a quiet place, if you are able, and simply allow your heart to rest as we pray these words together. Heavenly Father, I come before you today on behalf of every person listening to this message, every chosen one who has walked a road of obedience that cost them more than they ever expected. Lord, I lift up the ones who have obeyed you in secret, the ones whose sacrifices were never witnessed by another human being, the ones who carried the weight of their surrender alone, without applause, without recognition, without anyone standing beside them to acknowledge the depth of what they gave up. Father, I ask that you would speak to each of them now, just as you spoke to Abraham on that mountain, and let them know, in the deepest places of their hearts, that you have seen every step. Lord, for the one who left behind something stable and secure, because they sensed your calling leading them elsewhere, I pray that you would confirm, in this very moment, that their obedience was not a mistake. Give them peace in the midst of the uncertainty. Give them strength to continue walking, even if the provision has not yet fully appeared. Remind them that the ram is already positioned, that the resources they need have already been set in motion, waiting only for the moment their eyes are open to receive them. Father, for the one who has felt isolated because of a decision made in obedience to your voice, a decision that others around them did not understand or support, I pray that you would surround them with your presence in a way that fills the space left by human companionship. Let them feel, in this very moment, that they are not alone, that you have been walking beside them. Every single step of this journey, even during the loneliest nights, when it felt as though no one else could understand what they were carrying. Lord, for the one who has given sacrificially, whether of their time, their resources, or their comfort, trusting that you would provide in return, I pray that you would bring the provision they need swiftly and abundantly. Let them see, with their own eyes, the ram caught in the thicket, the resource that has already been prepared, waiting for the exact moment of need. Let their testimony become a source of encouragement to others who are walking through similar seasons of sacrifice and waiting. Father, I pray for the ones who feel weary today, the ones who have obeyed for so long without seeing the harvest they were promised. Renew their strength. Remind them of the promise found in your word, that those who do not grow weary in doing good will reap in due season. Give them the endurance to continue walking, even when the road feels longer than they expected. Let them remember Abraham's three-day journey, and let them find comfort in knowing that the waiting itself was part of the process that prepared him to receive the fullness of what you had for him. Lord, I ask that you would confirm, in a tangible and undeniable way, the obedience of everyone listening to this message. Just as you called out to Abraham at the exact moment his surrender was complete, call out to each of them now. Let them sense your voice speaking peace over their circumstances. Let them sense your assurance that their sacrifice has not been in vain, that their obedience has not gone unnoticed, and that the blessing you are preparing for them will exceed anything they could have imagined on their own. Father, break every spirit of doubt that has crept into their hearts during this season of waiting. Silence every voice that has told them they made a mistake, that their obedience was foolish, that the sacrifice they made will never be honored. Replace that doubt with a deep and unshakable confidence, the same confidence Abraham carried as he told his son, God will provide for himself the offering. Let each person listening today carry that same confidence into whatever mountain they are currently climbing. Lord, I thank you in advance for the testimonies that are being written even now, testimonies of provision, of breakthrough, of doors opening that once seemed permanently closed. I thank you for the ram already caught in the thicket, positioned long before this moment, waiting to be discovered at the exact time it is needed. I thank you for the covenant blessings you are preparing to declare over each person listening, blessings that will multiply far beyond what was originally sacrificed. Father, cover each chosen one listening to this message with your peace. Let them walk away from this prayer with renewed strength, renewed hope, and a settled confidence that heaven has been backing their obedience all along, even during the moments when it felt as though the silence would never break. In the name of the one who was himself the ultimate fulfillment of this very story, the Lamb that God provided for himself, we pray, Amen. Chosen one, I want you to sit for a moment in the stillness that follows this prayer. Whatever mountain you are climbing right now, whatever altar you have built in obedience, know that this prayer was not simply words spoken into the air. It was an agreement declared over your life, a declaration that heaven has heard and heaven is responding. As we move into this next portion of our time together, I want to speak to you about the deeper journey of healing and spiritual awakening that so often follows a season of costly obedience. Chosen one, obedience against all odds is rarely a single event that concludes neatly the moment provision arrives. It is often the beginning of an inward transformation, a renewal of the heart and mind that continues long after the ram has been found in the thicket. Think again about Abraham's descent from that mountain. He was not the same man who had climbed it 3 days earlier. Something within him had shifted permanently. He had walked to the very edge of complete surrender, and in doing so, he had encountered a depth of God's faithfulness that could never have been experienced through comfort alone. This is often how spiritual awakening unfolds. It rarely comes through ease. It comes through the fire of testing, through the walk up the mountain, through the moment when your own strength runs completely dry and you are left with nothing but trust. Chosen one, if you have walked through a season of costly obedience, I want you to understand that the healing you are experiencing now, or the healing you are about to experience, is not simply a return to how things were before. It is an elevation into a deeper relationship with God than you had previously known. Just as the sun begins to break across the horizon after the longest night, gently and steadily illuminating what darkness had hidden, the healing that follows obedience often unfolds slowly in layers, revealing new depths of peace and understanding that were not accessible before the test began. There is a gentle surrender that takes place in this stage of the journey, a surrender that differs from the surrender at the altar. The surrender at the altar was the surrender of obedience, the willingness to lay down what was most precious in trust that God would provide. This new surrender is the surrender of release, the willingness to let go of the anxiety, the striving, and the fear that often accompanies long seasons of waiting. It is the surrender that allows you to finally exhale, to finally rest in the confirmation that has arrived, without immediately searching for the next mountain to climb. Chosen one, I want to invite you into this posture of rest today. If you have been striving, if you have been carrying the weight of your obedience as though it still requires your constant effort to sustain it, I want you to hear this gently. The ram has already been found. The confirmation has already been declared. You do not need to keep climbing the same mountain over and over again, replaying the test in your mind, wondering if you did enough or gave enough. God has already spoken. Rest in what He has already confirmed. This process of awakening often includes a renewed sense of identity. Before Abraham climbed that mountain, he was known simply as a father who had waited decades for a promised son. After that mountain, he became known throughout Scripture and throughout history as the father of faith, the man whose obedience became the pattern for every believer who would follow after him. Chosen one, the very obedience that felt so costly, so isolating, and so uncertain, is shaping an identity within you that will carry forward into every season that follows. You are not simply the person who endured a difficult trial. You are becoming the person whose testimony will strengthen others who face similar mountains in years to come. Consider the imagery of dawn breaking after a long night. There is a particular quality to that first light, soft, gradual, and gentle, unlike the harshness of midday sun. It does not demand your attention. It simply arrives, steadily pushing back the darkness until the full light of day has taken its place. This is often how spiritual healing unfolds after a season of costly obedience. It does not arrive all at once, demanding that you immediately process everything you walked through. It arrives gently, in stages, allowing your heart to absorb the goodness of God's provision at a pace that feels sustainable and true. Chosen one, if you find yourself still processing the weight of what you walked through, if healing feels slow or incomplete, I want you to know that this is not a sign that something is wrong. Dawn does not arrive instantly. It unfolds gradually, and each stage of that unfolding is valuable, teaching your heart to trust more deeply in the faithfulness of the God who walked with you through the darkest hours of the night. There is also a renewed sense of trust that often develops in this stage, a trust that is different from the trust you carried before you walked through your season of testing. Before the test, your trust in God may have been largely theoretical, built on what you had heard or read or been taught by others. After walking through obedience against all odds, your trust becomes experiential, built on the personal memory of having walked through the fire and having witnessed, with your own eyes, the ram caught in the thicket. This kind of trust cannot be shaken as easily as the trust you carried before, because it is no longer simply a belief about God's character. It is a lived experience of His faithfulness. Chosen one, allow this season of healing to deepen your trust in ways that will sustain you through every future mountain you are called to climb. You have proven, through your obedience, that you are the kind person who does not withhold what is most precious from God, even when the instruction makes no sense. This proven character will carry you through every future test with a confidence that could not have existed before you walked this particular road. As we move toward the conclusion of our time together, I want you to carry this truth with you. Healing and awakening are not separate from the obedience you have already walked through. They are the natural fruit of that obedience, the gentle dawn that follows the darkest night, the deep rest that follows the exhausting climb. You are not the same person who began this journey. You have been transformed by the very act of trusting God against all odds, and that transformation will continue to unfold gently, gradually, and beautifully in the days and seasons ahead. If this message has meant something to you, if something in these words named what you have been living in a way that landed with the weight of recognition, I want to invite you to press, like as a way of saying so, without needing to find the words. It is a simple gesture, but it carries this message to the next chosen one, who is sitting in their own waiting season and has not yet found the language for what they are carrying. Your like is not a social media action in this moment. It is an act of passing something forward. If you feel moved to leave something in the comments, even a single word, you do something generous by doing so. You ensure that every chosen one who finds this message in the days and weeks ahead does not arrive to silence. They arrive to a community of people who were here before them and who marked their presence. No one who finds their way to this message has to feel like they arrived alone. There is also a donation link in the pinned comment below, and if this message has given you something real, if something shifted in you today that you want to pass forward to the next person who needs it, that link is the place to leave it. No pressure, no expectation. Simply an open hand for whatever you feel moved to offer. Type the word "I receive" in the comments if you are ready to walk through the door. If everything that has been moving in you during this message has settled into a quiet, certain yes, the final word of this message is waiting for you, and it was written just for you. Chosen one, we have walked a long road together in this message, much like the 3 days Abraham walked toward the mountain of testing. We began by reminding you that you are here today by divine appointment, not by accident. We walked through the story of a man who was asked to do something that made no sense according to everything he understood about God's promises, and yet he obeyed anyway, rising early, saddling his donkey, carrying the wood, and walking toward a mountain whose outcome he could not yet see. We explored the spiritual meaning behind that altar, discovering that God was never interested in loss for the sake of loss, but was testing the posture of a heart fully surrendered. We identified the signs that reveal when heaven is backing an act of obedience, and we heard the testimony of a woman named Miriam, whose own journey mirrored the very pattern we have been exploring together. We stood together at the emotional peak of this message, hearing the voice of heaven call out at the precise moment of complete surrender, declaring that obedience had been seen, tested, and honored. We anchored these truths in the unshakable foundation of Scripture, and we lifted these promises up together in prayer. And we walked gently into the process of healing and awakening that so often follows a season of costly obedience, discovering that transformation continues long after the ram has been found. Chosen one, if there is one truth I want you to carry away from everything we have walked through together today, it is this: your obedience has not gone unnoticed. Every step you took in faith, every sacrifice you made in secret, Every moment you chose trust over fear when everything visible argued against it has been seen, recorded, and honored by the God who watches over your life with more attention and care than you could ever fully comprehend. Just as Abraham's obedience against all odds resulted in a covenant blessing that multiplied far beyond what was originally promised, your obedience is setting into motion a season of confirmation and multiplication that will exceed what you have dared to hope for. The road may have felt long, the silence may have felt heavy at times, stretching across days, months, or even years. But I want you to remember the pattern woven through this entire story. The ram was already there, positioned by a God who knew, long before Abraham ever set foot on that mountain, exactly what would be needed at exactly the right moment. Whatever you are waiting for right now, whatever provision your own obedience is still awaiting, know that it has likely already been positioned, waiting only for the moment your eyes are open to receive it. Chosen one, if this message has spoken to something deep within your spirit today, if you recognized your own story woven into the story of Abraham and Isaac, I want to ask you for something simple. If you believe that heaven is backing your obedience, take a moment right now to like this video so that this message can reach others who are walking through their own season of costly obedience, wondering if their sacrifice has been noticed. Subscribe to this channel so that you can continue receiving messages that remind you of God's faithfulness during every season of your journey. And if you know someone in your life who has recently obeyed God against overwhelming odds, someone who could use the encouragement found in this message, share this video with them today. Your obedience in sharing this message may be the very confirmation someone else has been waiting to hear. As we come to the close of our time together, I want to leave you with a final blessing. May the God who spoke to Abraham at the exact moment of his complete surrender speak to you now, in this very moment, confirming every step of obedience you have walked out in faith. May the provision that has already been prepared for you be revealed swiftly, arriving not a moment too late, but at the precise time it is needed most. May the isolation you have felt during your season of obedience be replaced with a deep and abiding sense of God's presence, walking beside you through every step of the journey. May the weariness that has accumulated during your long walk up the mountain be replaced with renewed strength, the kind of strength that comes from having witnessed the faithfulness of God firsthand. And may the covenant blessing that heaven is preparing to declare over your life exceed anything you have dared to hope for, multiplying far beyond what you originally sacrificed, just as it did for Abraham on that mountain so long ago. Chosen one, you have obeyed against all odds. You have carried the wood up the mountain without seeing the lamb, trusting that God would provide. You have stretched out your hand in complete surrender, even when the outcome remained uncertain. And now, heaven is responding. Heaven is backing every step you have taken. The ram has already been positioned. The blessing has already been prepared. And the voice that once called out to Abraham on that ancient mountain is calling out to you today, confirming that your obedience has been seen, your sacrifice has been honored, and your faithfulness will be rewarded beyond measure. Walk forward from this message with confidence, chosen one. The mountain you have climbed was never meant to end in loss. It was always meant to become the very place where the Lord provides. Go now in peace, carrying the assurance that heaven has never abandoned you, and heaven never will.